Welcome to Manifold. My guest is Bharat Karnad. He is Emeritus Professor in National Security Studies at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. Karnad was a member of India's first National Security Advisory Board and its Nuclear Doctrine Drafting Group. He's the author of numerous books, including Nuclear Weapons and Indian Security, The Realist Foundations of Strategy, India's Nuclear Policy, and Why India is Not a Great Power Yet. Bharat, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Stu.
So it's a pleasure to have you. I think my audience is going to learn an incredible amount of stuff from you today. I would like you to just start out by talking a little bit about your childhood. And I know you're educated in the United States, so maybe you could just tell the story of your childhood and how you got to the U.S.
Sure. Actually, I went to a boarding school, a military school here. It was called, during the British times, of course, I'm post-47, so I don't know anything about it, but it was called the King George's Royal Indian Military College. And it was a feeder school to the Sandhurst Academy in England for would-be Indian officers to be commissioned into the Indian Army, the then British Indian Army. After independence, these schools, there are 5 of them all over India. They were renamed into something called King George's Schools. And then they got renamed again into the place, so the Belgaum Military School. This was based in Belgaum, which is in peninsular India, little east of Goa, just to fix things, a little southwest of Bombay. And it is up in the hills. It is in what they call the Western Ghats. It's a highland formation up in the peninsular India. And so it's a beautiful place to be in. And it helped that my hometown was just 48 miles away. So going to boarding school was made easier for me because I went to school at when I was 7 years old. And that's awfully early. But then it steeled me for life as I see it, in some sense, because you learn to survive in a boarding school. Whatever else you learn or don't learn, that's what you learn. And it turns out that, my dad was in the railways. He was a civil engineer. And then he was curiously deputed to the Atomic Energy Commission, where he was Chief Engineer Tarapong, the first atomic energy power plant that was General Electric, light water plant, reactor. They were set up there by General Electric, and the main construction company was Bechtel, I think. And my dad was the supervising chief engineer from the Indian side, overseeing everything. And so my dad, therefore, had connections to the atomic energy, the BARC community, the Bhabha Atomic Research Community in Trombay. And just to cut the story short, when I came back and got into this business of nuclear strategy and so on, and this happened after 1998, and the test, the hydrogen bomb test, the fusion test, the so-called S1 test, which I immediately wrote thereafter, and I wrote that I said that it was a dud, it was a fizzle, and that got me the attention of Dr. P.K. Iyengar, who was a former chairman of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission, and who actually started the thermonuclear project and was the main architect of the 1974 test, etc. And he asked me, when he heard my name and he read my piece, he said, "Why do you say that?" And I gave my, it wouldn't satisfy a physicist like you, but it was a layman's notion of what may have gone wrong. And it seemed to resonate with what Dr. Iyengar thought was the problem with the thermonuclear test device. And so then next thing he asked me was, your name, are you related? And then he mention of dad's name. I said, yeah, I'm his son. And so that established a connection. And then I think from there we got along famously. And then I got to know other colleagues of his that were my dad's colleagues as well in the bar. Though my dad was not main bar community, he came in from the railways. But, there was this larger sense of community at that time.
Could I just jump in for a second and clarify a couple points for my audience? So, Bharat mentioned Homi Bhabha, who is sometimes referred to as the father of the Indian nuclear program, both the energy and the weapons program. He was a theoretical physicist. Some people in my audience will be familiar with something called Bhabha scattering, which all physicists know about. And we are going to talk later about the early days of the Indian nuclear program, the mysterious death of Bhabha, and the event that Bharat is mentioning, this nuclear test, which I think it's somewhat controversial whether they successfully achieved the thermonuclear step or the Ulam-Teller mechanism, and still, I think, disputed somewhat today. And that's something I would love to get into further. But sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to clarify a few points. Go ahead.
Right. So, I think around, I got into my head really that I wanted to get out of the country and study outside. And I appeared for the SAT test, and I got fairly good, percentile ranking, 98, 99%, something like that. I was better at the English language, actually, than I was in maths and so on. But it was pretty good. So then I got what I was looking out for was basically, essentially a scholarship, because my father just told me plain in my face that I cannot afford to send you. All I can afford to buy you is a one-way ticket if you manage the monies. I said, that's fair. My mother didn't want me to go because she told my dad, look, if you're going to let him go, you lose him. So, so she was a bit paranoid about that. But I managed to get a reasonable scholarship, and then he bought me my one-way ticket to Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara. And, it was, my admission was in the undergraduate program in chemical and nuclear engineering. So I started out as, it was the first batch of nuclear and chemical engineering in the University of California system, undergrad. And so I was, ostensibly going to be part of it. But I soon realized that I was, treading water because I was simply not bright enough. Once I got in, I somehow managed for a year and then decided, well, I had to get out. And I told the Dean of Foreign Students in Santa Barbara, look, I really have to change my major. He said, go ahead, do so. And I was surprised because I thought the money given me was for chemical and nuclear engineering. He said, no, look, you have all the freedom in the world. You can change as you wish. So I did change to political science. And then there at the time at Santa Barbara, there was something called the College of Creative Studies, which allowed you, it matured later, but the concept was initiated around the time when I was there, 67, when I joined, 68, I think, something like that. And so it allowed you to fashion your own major, meaning you could have courses from various departments and so on. And whatever courses then you totaled up the units and you got your degree, essentially. So I did this, I did psychology, a bit of social anthropology and so on. It was a mixed up major. But the major was political science. So I got my undergrad in political science. And then it turned out that I remember writing something on deterrence or something, which caught my fancy in my senior year. And I wrote a paper. I remember getting an A or something like that for it. And I had not applied to UCLA. I don't know why, because Bernard Brodie was there, the great Bernard Brodie, who was one of the founders of RAND, the Yale Institute of International Studies and so on. And one of the great pioneers of strategic thought, the author of The Absolute Weapon, etc. And because I had not formally applied to UCLA, I just sent him my paper and I said, look, not only do I want admission to write my dissertation under you, but I also want monies. It's a tall order. So I met him, he called me, and he said, fine. So he arranged something. But then, I got through my SHIFIL, the qualifier exam and so on. And then I sort of fell out with him because, for whatever reasons, I discovered that, and one of my seniors in the PhD program said, look, don't upset him by challenging him, because he doesn't take it kindly. These are human frailties. I was a little too full of myself. And so, I kept on. Anyway, the thing is, our relations went south. And I decided, well, there was that. And then after my qualifiers, all I had to do was write my dissertation. The first chapter was actually just the survey of literature, etc., which I had already done. And then, so I then came back after actually 10 years in California. It was just too good to ride, because in those days, there was a lot of money. University of California, at least the foreign students were funded, as was much of the UC system, with oil revenues from the California oil wells. So it was very rich at the time, and they didn't know what to do with it. So I benefited from it. So you know how it is. The graduate school, you're on the gravy train, you ride along. Then about 10 years later, I came back home in 76. And by then I had got very thickly into the nuclear strategy and so on. And I didn't know what to do with it, because India had not yet, in 76, India had exploded the weapon in 74, but had done nothing with it. So then there was not much of a future, as it were, in that field. So I, with no great ideas of what to do next, I don't know whether you heard of a great literature called Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh, he's said to have written, reportedly, the definitive history of the Sikhs, the history of the Sikhs, a 2-volume tome published by Princeton University Press. So obviously it has considerable heft, intellectual heft. Anyway, he was nominated or made the editor of the Hindustan Times, which was one of the premier dailies in India. And he had read me somewhere, and I was in California at that time. I was, sort of yo-yoing between California and here, and I was in California in 79. And he said, well, do you want to be my assistant editor in the Hindustan Times? So I said, fine, lovely, because I had no idea what I was doing anyway. So I came back, and my journalism career then was for exactly 10 years, which included reporting on 2 wars, the very long Iran-Iraq war. I went to the Suzangard front and so on, reporting from there. It was great fun, actually. And then at the 83, 81, 83, whatever. I may be getting the dates wrong. But the Lebanon war, Israeli intervention into Lebanon. So at that time, India didn't have any good relations with Israel. So I was amongst the first, maybe also only Indian really, to be there. So I was accorded all the facilities by the Israelis, who were very happy to escort me around and so on. And I lived as a reporter for the duration of my stay there, a reportage about 2 weeks or something, in Kiryat Shimona, which is a kibbutz on the border of Lebanon. And then that was the way they required it to be done, meaning that all the reporters had to come back into Israel at night. You could go into Lebanon and come back. That was the arrangement. Fortunately for me, I met Major General Aharon Yariv, who was Moshe Dayan's intelligence chief in the Sinai campaign, 1956. And he was there as a reservist. He had his Major General rank, and it said reserve. And I was rather taken up by him. Of course, I knew him by sight because I had read the Sinai diary, the Sinai campaign diary, and seen his photographs. And I suddenly realized he was still very young looking. He didn't have white hair or gray hair, anything of the kind. And so we sat down, and he was sort of intrigued by me. And we began talking. And he told me about the planned strike, Indo-Israeli strike on Kahota, the Pakistani nuclear complex. So I broke the story, because essentially he just said that, look, we were going to do all the dirty work, and Indira Gandhi pulled out at the last minute. She got cold feet. Maybe because the U.S. intelligence had alerted the Americans or the Pakistanis or however it happened. But Israelis were not going to be deterred because they were going in, and the plan generally was for a complement of F-16 strike aircraft with the specialist ordnance that would penetrate deep penetration weapons and so on, carrying these weapons, and then these are going to be brought into India and stationed in Udhampur, which is in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And what the Israeli aircraft would do was you had the complement of F-16 aircraft and combat air patrol complement of F-15 aircraft. So they would fly together to provide, the F-15 top layer would provide protection for the strike aircraft going into target, and so on and so forth. And the idea was for them to come in over the Arabian Sea southward so the Pakistani radar won't pick them up, come into Jamnagar, which today is famous for the largest refinery in the world, owned by the richest man in India, Ambani's, as you perhaps are aware. And it was also the center for it was called the TAC-D, which is Tactical Development of the Indian Air Force Station. And the aircraft would come in there, both the F-15 complement and the F-16 complement. So very quickly, to get through it, the idea was the complement would come into Jamnagar, the Israeli crew would rest, and so on and so forth, and then take off, fly overland into India, and come into Udhampur for final, fueling up and uploading of the ordnance, specialist ordnance. And then the aircraft was to just, the rows of attacking aircraft would fly over into Kahuta and the underground complex at Golra and, blow them up. And the idea was it'd be so fast coming in from the Indian side, it would give them, the Pakistanis, only about 2 minutes notice, 3 minutes notice. So they couldn't do anything. They couldn't erect their RBS 70 millimeter guns, which was the only air defense gun available, etc. And if you recall, the Israelis had taken out the Osirak reactor the year before. So I'm talking about 82. The planned operation was in 82. In 81, under Menachem Begin, they'd taken out the Osirak reactor. So these were very experienced crews coming in, and they knew what they were doing. And then this was cancelled at the last minute by Indira Gandhi. And the only thing I recall from my meeting with Aaron Yariv, General Yariv, was he was so frustrated and upset. He said, "We are doing all the damn work for you, dirty work for you, and you guys back out, and it would have aided you," which is absolutely right. And it would have been a very different universe had, we gone along with it and so on. So, well, that didn't work. Anyway, to cut the story short, in 84, I came to in Washington as the Washington correspondent. One Indian, one chief, one bureau, one Indian, one chief. So I was covering America for, for 3.5 years. And I made I had great many friends in California. And curiously, my UCLA graduate project mate, we were working on the Vladivostok talks, SALT 1 talks. And what I was specifically working on, and I was in the strategic aspects of my area of research at that time was strategic. And the target thing was the Vladivostok talks. And the problem assigned me was, how do you negotiate between a side that has a very big throw weight that Russia had and very good accuracy that the Americans had, terminal accuracy. So how do you negotiate? It's apples and oranges, really. And that was the real conundrum of the SALT 1. Assuming you wanted to very much reduce your strategic arsenals, the question was, how would you negotiate it? It was an interesting, sort of problem for me. So I did something, and I remember it was under the RAND ARPA or something. I don't quite remember now. Aegis and all that. So then I came back to India and so on. And then something called Business India is a big publishing company. They offered me editorship of something called India Week, a weekly that I founded, and I ran it into the ground in 17 months flat. And I really realized that I had the Peter Principle, reached my level of incompetence as a journalist, and I wanted to get the hell out, get back to my field. And it just so happened that my writings got as assistant editor and so on in Star Times, and then my writings in my own periodical India Week. It was not W-E-E-K-E, it was W-E-A-K in my case. So that bombed. But fortunately for me, I got out of journalism and into what I consider my field. And thereafter, my writings had all along got the attention of many people in the establishment. People like K.C. Pant, who was the former defense minister. And in fact, he was the defense minister. And he used to, call me in for discussing ideas and so on. And he introduced me to his BJP counterpart, Bharatiya Janata Party counterpart, Jaswant Singh, whom I got very close to. So, and both of them, I should talk with them about policy alternatives, what we should do, how we should be more, hard power oriented, etc. It was really quite a departure from what they usually heard from most people in Delhi, and they're sort of taken up by it. And then in 1998, when the tests happened and the NSAB was set up, the National Security Advisory Board, they got me in, and then we helped draft the doctrine. Just three of us really drafted the doctrine, even though there are 26 on the so-called drafting group, because none of them knew anything about deterrence literature. And that was my bread and butter, really. And K. Subramanian, who was an autodidact. So he had taught himself deterrence theory and so on. In the 50s, he had been in Hudson Institute and, parlayed with Herman Kahn and so on. So he had taught himself, and he was really very good. And so between the two of us and another person, we drafted the doctrine. And it was more wishy-washy than I wanted, but then, he explained to me, look, one of the problems was that in the drafting committee, it was, in a sense, preempted by the Prime Minister, who on May 28th, in his suo motu statement to Parliament, actually said that first of all, we are going to have a minimum deterrence. And secondly, we are going to go in for no first use as a principle. So, we were, our parameters are pretty much, defined for us. And so Mr. Subramaniam, an old stalwart civil servant, explained to me, who was a neophyte in these matters. He said, look, if we write our own doctrine, which we think is right for the country, the government will merely trash it, because the Prime Minister has already said in Parliament what it needs to be. That it has to be minimum deterrence by way of concept, and whatever forces you can fit into that concept, and the no first use principle. And that's how the draft doctrine came out. It had whatever traction it did. And the government then, in its wisdom or lack of it, in 2004, used it as, I don't know what, but completely went off and formalized something called massive retaliation, without, I think, any of these guys understanding what massive retaliation is. And of course, I junked that notion, what they call the gazetted notion of the doctrine. But I think it would not be wrong to say that the actual the operational concept that the Strategic Forces Command in India follows is what our original draft doctrine said, which is really more flexible response and not massive. Massive doctrine or something like that is basically conceived by people who don't understand anything about deterrence, know nothing about deterrence literature, and merely taken to the idea of massive as a deterrent to what? Pakistan? My whole idea was it's so silly. It sort of completely was always used to perplex me when I came back to hear Pakistan as a threat. Well, one thing Pakistan is not is a threat. Over the 30, 40 years here, I've been saying that Pakistan is a nuisance, not a threat. And if we are unable to distinguish between a nuisance and a threat, then we have a problem. Pakistanis don't. In fact, we have ended up elevating them in the world because we think of them as a threat. More and more, I think the government is coming down to that point of view because, and I've been saying in my books and so on, I've been recommending what to do, and they've been following up. As some senior army general said the other day to me, what you've been saying we're doing now. And one of the things I mentioned was to gain Pakistani confidence, inspire confidence in them. Because they feel paranoid and they feel that India is out to reunify and get the old India, etc. All that nonsense. But I essentially say to them that, one of my recommendations was to demobilize the 3 strike corps, which is way in excess of need for the Pakistani border contingency. 3 strike corps is enormous number of tanks. 3,000 tanks. I mean, ridiculous. Everybody's a Rommel, and so everybody wants to be not just a Rommel, but who are the other great Nazi armored generals? Von Manstein, the great von Manstein,
Guderian.
And Guderian. They completely miss out on what is not having scale or perspective. Anyway, that's what. But now,
so if I could just jump in. So for my audience, so Bharat has advocated that India focus less on Pakistan as the main threat and more on China. The strike force was really aimed at Pakistan, and he advocates reallocating those resources to something that's focused more on toward Tibet and China. And that would inspire confidence building in the Pakistan-India relationship, because then they're less immediately threatened by India, and also then would tie down a lot of PLA forces across the border in China. Is that a fair?
Yeah, absolutely fair. I think the thing is also that one of the things to do is, Pakistan, again, one of the things I think Western analysts simply do not understand is the cultural aspect and the India-Pakistan thing. The cultural aspect is very, very serious. It's like the dilemma that the Chinese have in dealing with Taiwan, let's say. There's the ethnic Han homogeneity, that identity notion that, well, we are the same people, so why are you trying to be separate kind of a thing, you see? And now this is not good for India-Pakistan, but the fact is they were one people, and there are more Muslims in India now than there are in Pakistan. That's a fact of life. And one of the reasons why India-Pakistan wars have been not wars really, it is in a beautiful phrase that Stephen Cohen, who was the South Asia expert, the late Stephen Cohen at Brookings and earlier the University of Illinois. It is a beautiful thing when he said that India, and it was told to him by a former director of military operations of the Indian Army, Major General D.K. Punnett, who's dead now, but he was perhaps the finest scholar soldier the Indian Army has ever produced. And he called India-Pakistan wars communal riots with tanks. It's a very apt example. And I took that very seriously and did an analysis that was published in the Roundtable in London. Roundtable, as you perhaps are aware, is the Commonwealth Journal of International Affairs. And it was published there. And what I essentially said was precisely this, that the cultural element prevents India from embarking on a war or executing a war of annihilation. It's therefore a war of maneuver. You don't want to decimate anything or do anything, you just want to just get rid of a few tanks on the other side, and similarly, they respond with doing the same thing. So they're really not serious, because they go onto the battlefield and share the same wavelength for their battlefield tactical communications. It's completely ridiculous. It's called the Bravo link. It's completely ridiculous. These are kinds of anomalies, but, it was the old original army. They kept the same wavelength for battlefield tactical communications, even when they're fighting each other. So they knew where the blows were going to come from. So they merely fainted and they got away from there. And nothing ever happened. They just, crisscrossed the border and just beat up on each other, a few tanks lost here and there. Anyway, the point to make is that these are not serious wars. So therefore, I have never considered them serious wars. Of course, when I talk this way, and I have done so for 30 years, it used to originally upset the army audience, military audiences that I used to speak to. But I used to say, look, be dispassionate and look at it objectively. And you realize what I'm saying is right. And I said, what's the reason? The reason is we are India and Pakistan, whether anybody likes it or not, are connected by kith and kinship relationship still. All the places of Islamic Muslim pilgrimage that Pakistanis want to go to are all in India. All the great Islamic seminaries, the Sunni Islamic seminary, the Barelvi and the Deobandi seminaries are in India. All the great monuments, Taj Mahal, whatever, the emperors built are in India. Pakistan is what was a rump element of the border. It's what they call a frontier state. Punjab always was, even in the British Empire. And that's what the Pakistanis are stuck with. They have no history, they have no identity, they have no culture. For everything, they look to India because all the centers are here. And now in the more popular culture, your Bollywood, well, they kind of swing to the Bollywood tunes and dances. I mean, it's all Bollywood. It's completely Indianized. I've been to Pakistan a great number of times. I've addressed their military audiences there. They understand what I'm saying more than our people here do. Or at least they act as if, they're very upset and so on. But now I think what I've been saying all along is now the military is now taking it seriously. And now they are moving, as I said, the 3-strike corps that we have are being demobilized in a substantive way. I said, keep one corps for contingency. Sure, you can't rule out some madman in Islamabad doing some damn fool things. Okay, fine. So you have that composite corps for the Pakistan contingencies, but both the 2-strike corps manpower and whatever war material can be used from the plains to the hills into the mountains to form 2 additional offensive mountain corps with very light tanks, not the heavy M72, T-72s that are there now, which makes no sense at all. Up in the mountains, Sikkim plains, on the Tibetan plateau at 14,000 feet. I mean, it's hard to start up the tanks in the morning, honestly. They use bazookas to warm up the tanks in the mornings for them to just to start the damn things. So it's a bit of a farce, really. We need to rethink our entire thing, and I've been saying that. And now, fortunately, I think the government is finally on track. There's been one offensive mountain corps formed, the 17 Corps, and I've said 2 more corps to the Western Front, and which, by the way, is substantively being done because they have already moved to the China Front. 2 major corps from the... But they're keeping the establishment because they don't want to give that up, and they want Pakistanis to think that these are 2 actual strike corps. They are not. They are really hollow establishment, headquarters establishments, with the main fighting elements already up in the Ladakh plains, in the Ladakh sector, where the last round of hostilities took place on the Galwan River. So yes, I mean, I think we are finally getting to where China is is being seen as the premier and main threat, and perhaps the only threat, as I see it, the only threat. I've been saying that you can really literally vacate the western border of the military, nothing will happen. Keep the paramilitaries there, that's more than enough. So anyway, I don't think that's a little too extreme, and I don't think the Indian government will ever, and military won't allow that kind of advice to be realized.
Do you think that something on the India-China border, which goes beyond just a minor kind of scuffle border clash, is a real possibility in the next decade? Is that...
Well, it is. Yeah, it is a possibility in the sense that, one of the problems, and I think this is the kind of Chinese diplomacy that has flummoxed a lot of parties who have dealt with them, all over the place. For instance, they formalized the McMahon line that in the northeast that was bequeathed to us by the British. as the border for Myanmar, Burma. But it's the same McMahon line that they don't accept in India. Either you have to be consistent that McMahon line is a colonial construct and it's imperial design, whatever it is. Okay, fine. Then stick with it. But with Myanmar, you have said, okay, you can have the McMahon line as the border. So they've not been consistent. And they've also been, they haven't kept to the commitments they make on paper. And our emir is a bit fuddy-duddy type people who believe in sticking to the letter of the law, as it were. And they believe in dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And that makes it problematic because they don't look at it in a more abstract sense of what it's the message that's sought to be conveyed by the Chinese. Chinese haven't come out and said, but the fact is that the Chinese have, the way they're going about it, incremental annexation and occupation of Indian territory on the Indian side of the line of actual control, is that they conceived of something called, they conceived of their border in 1959. It's called the 1959 line in the literature. And the 1959 line was first propounded by Zhou Enlai, Premier Zhou Enlai, and of course India said no, that doesn't conform to the McMahon line principle that we believe in, which is the watershed principle, and then etc. So that's why the dispute has lingered, except the Chinese have been clandestinely, surreptitiously moving a little at a time. And because the McMahon line was drawn with a very broad pen nib, on the paper, on the map, you can see that, but actually on the ground, it can cover a lot of distance, right? As you know. So that is a real problem. So we really, some of these differences are in some sense irreconcilable, simply because you are on two different negotiating principles as to what to negotiate. Anyway,
Can I ask,
sure.
from the viewpoint of a strategist in China, what do they actually stand to gain? So, there may be some dispute over the history and how this border should be drawn, but is either side really, or particularly the Chinese side, going to make any use of territory they might gain from India? It seems like from the Chinese perspective, they're facing a U.S., possibly a big U.S. coalition, which could include India. Why should they exacerbate negative feelings in India toward them over territory, which to them I think is pretty useless, right? Am I wrong? Am I sort of misunderstanding the reality here?
No, I'm not sure whether I can speak for the Chinese and what their perspective is. All I
Yeah,
can
what I
do by
meant is if you could just pretend for a moment you're the Chinese strategist, why, and someone comes to your office and says, why don't you just settle this? You settled Vladivostok and all these borders with the Russians, the Amur River, you settled all this, and now you can have a nice relationship with the Russians. Why don't you settle all this with the Indians? And that will maybe prevent them from being overactive in the Quad or something. So something
yeah.
along those lines. If you're the Chinese strategist, what's your response?
No, I agree. That would be a reasonable thing for them to do, if only not
Yeah.
to open up too many fronts against themselves. That would be the obvious
Yes.
things to do. You choose your enemies, and you say,
Yes.
well, okay, US is a far more consequential adversary to deal with than India is. Then let's settle with the lesser adversary and neutralize that front. Because surely, if that front is neutralized, India would be out of it. India would have no incentive then to front up with China or help the Americans do anything in this part of the world. But so much bad blood has now flown down the river, as it were, that I'm not sure this will work in Beijing because there are vested interests there. The southern Tibet commander, for instance, the more territory he captures, the more accolades he gets, the more
Yes.
likelihood that he's then elevated to CMC. You know what the politics is.
Yes.
So you're a wolf.
I accept that description, and but I would just say the following. First of all, if you ask a random person on the street in Beijing, or even a highly placed academic or highly placed party member, they don't really have emotional feelings about that border. If it shifts a few kilometers, I don't think they care. Whereas recovering Taiwan, they have deep emotional feelings about, right? So it seems like that's a problem that could be settled. I just don't quite understand why they don't do it. Now, some people claim they do it because they want to have a little lever that they can pull every now and then that discomfits the Indian political leadership, right? So they can cause something to happen which wrongfoots Modi, and by promising kind of not to do that, maybe they can gain leverage with the Indian leadership on some other issue. Maybe that's why they keep it an open matter. I'm just curious how you think
No,
about this.
absolutely. In fact, that's what I've written. And the Chinese have from the very beginning, I think, if you recall, the Chinese impressions of India are very negative. They've talked of India as a slave nation, which I think all of that is very well merited, if you see what I mean. We have, I remember, and I quote this in my book, Nuclear Weapons in Indian Security, Polish sociologist who settled down in England, and his description of India as a land of subjugations. It fits in with, I have great contempt for India in the sense that we are too easily subjugated. And that is, I can entirely, completely understand why the Chinese had that, they felt humiliated when after the open door policy under the Hay thing in the 19th century and so on, they felt humiliated. And they have sought to, in a sense, recover from the century of humiliation. But there's no such sense of humiliation in India. And we have been, colonized and enslaved, as it were, for far longer than a century. Ours was under the British Crown and the East India Company for much, much longer. So I completely understand that. And I understand the same kind of feelings that the Vietnamese have, of very strongly, strengthening their capabilities to deter and dissuade any would-be colonizer or, someone who's, a bully, like the Vietnamese perceive the Chinese, etc. So I entirely understand that that notion of, shall we say, contempt that the Chinese have held India in and Indian people in. And just to go back, Rabindranath Tagore, who was the first Indian Nobel Prize winner for literature in 1913, I think, he went to China as the great Asian peacemaker in Chiang Kai-shek's time. And he was booed by young Chinese at the time, who booed him as a representative of a slave nation and so on. So that the common Chinese, the popular Chinese perception of India is very, very, it's very, shall we say, it's very stable in the sense that this has always been how they looked at India. A large country which doesn't make sense for them. How was it so easily captured? How was it so easily dominated? You know what I mean? So they can't make head or tail of it. And yet, I think one of the things that Mao was warned about when he sort of embarked on the 62 war was he was reminded that this is the great Indian army that defeated the Nazis and, the Southeast Asia Command. That defeated the Imperial Japanese land forces. They defeated the Afrika Korps under Rommel in North Africa, etc. And by the way, most of the hard fighting was done by the Indian divisions, the 4th Indian Division, the 8th Indian Division, etc., in the Desert War, and the 14th Army under William Slibb in Burma. So you have a tremendous fighting thing, and this was a little after Second World War. So the Mao was warned, look, this is the great Indian army. Except the great Indian army was nothing on the China front, because there was no Indian army they were all in canvas shoes at the heights, another kind of thing. So because Nehru from the very beginning had this notion of Sino-Indian entente to guide Asia, etc. It's the same old Rabindranath Tagore notion, and others have sort of flogged this for a long time. It has made no impression on Chinese, because I think they really think of us below their level, and that you can't deal with India as an equal simply because it is not. So, as you know, the Chinese notion of hierarchy is very, very stiff. So they see themselves as peer competitors and rivals to America, which is what they think their station in international affairs is, and they don't want to deal with India on an equal basis. So, they would rather that India accept what China tells them, what China tells it to do. If they did, then we'd have peace. But this is exactly where I think they have sort of misjudged India now, because
So
they've pushed
I'm
India a little too far.
I'm a generation younger than you, so I'm gonna say something a little more optimistic about
Sure.
India-China relations. I would say most Chinese, obviously, most Chinese in China don't know that much about India, but most of them actually have a lot of respect because there's so many talented Indians out in the world. It's hard to ignore, and it's another ancient civilization where Buddhism came from, etc.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
actually, I think they have a lot of respect and some kind of, yeah, I think the South Asian and East Asian cultures are not one; they're quite different, but there is some kind of pan-Asian instinctive solidarity there still, which could be drawn on. I think the main question is just they see themselves ahead of the Indians in terms of development because they managed to develop very fast. Maybe the two countries were equal in development in 1960, and then the Chinese got ahead. So now there is some level of contempt probably because they're thinking, why didn't these guys, they have democracy, but why couldn't they get organized like us and get ahead? So I think that's certainly there. But I think at the level of strategic relations, I find it strange that they wouldn't settle this so that they can have an amicable relationship as they have with the Russians. Many people thought they were never going to have an amicable relationship with the Russians because of the border disputes and all kinds of unequal treaties and things like this. Much worse actually than anything between China and India, right? And
Absolutely.
yet now they seem to have a very warm relationship. And anyway, so maybe I'm too optimistic, but I like to think something like that is possible in the future.
No, I think, look, just so you know about, I mean, you mentioned China and Russia. In the latest map they have issued, they have again incorporated the Ussuri territory within China and upset the Russians right now, about a month
Yeah,
ago. So it's an ongoing problem. In some sense, the revanchist China that everybody apprehends is and that's, in a sense, spawning a lot of anxieties everywhere. Whether it's the Nine Dash Line, whether it is North Vietnam, where they have, of course, agreed on a border, but they keep, trying to arm twist the Vietnamese. Then there's Taiwan, there's Senkaku in the East Sea, then there's the McMahon Line, the line of actual control versus India, there's the Ussuri River border with Russia, and they seem not to give up. It's one thing to say, well, okay, at Xi Jinping's level, that they'll, And by the way, in the cultural thing, you're absolutely right. What I meant by way of contempt was in the political realm, as an enslaved nation. They, curiously, I was invited to be a foreign fellow, visiting fellow, whatever they call them, at the Shanghai Institute of National Studies. And they wanted me to be there for a longer time. And I was just there for 6 weeks. I said no. So I traveled a lot in China at the time and talked to people who could speak English. Unfortunately, I can't speak Mandarin, to my regret. But the respect for culture is absolutely there. I mean, the legends of the Monkey King is very much like the Hanuman from Ramayana. And I'm sure it was taken from Ramayana by the Buddhists and however that thing went. And the travels westward by the Monkey King and his entourage to the Western Kingdom was India, basically. And so all that is very much there in their minds. And they're not, so I'm not downplaying that. I'm merely saying by way of the political reality in modern times, why India has been politically subjugated, not culturally subjugated.
yeah.
Despite everything, it has retained its basic cultural ethos
Yeah.
and
I
principles.
I do want to agree with you that PRC is capable of incredible great power, autism, pissing off all of its neighbors, right? They're fully capable of that. So you shouldn't think of them as 10 feet tall in terms of diplomatic terms either. They can create without knowing it, a huge alliance against themselves by just acting like
No, absolutely. I
aggressive
think,
jerks, right?
yeah, but
Um,
you mentioned the strategic discomfiting of India, which is an ongoing thing, and they're very good at it. Let's put it this way: I have said in my writings that and I've said that if India cannot summon the kind of strategic mind that the Chinese can, just emulate them. Don't think, just emulate the Chinese. And I've said that one way to, and I suppose this is bloody minded, but the Chinese went ahead and nuclear missile armed Pakistan in a very deliberate way to contain India to the subcontinent. And I've said that one of the ways to do is to respond. And I said that to the National Security Advisory Board. Let's do it. Now we are doing it, passing on BrahMos and these kind of cruise missiles, supersonic cruise missiles to the island territories, Southeast Asia, and so on. And but I said then, by way of priority, send it to Vietnam. Because Vietnam is one country that the Chinese respect a whole lot because they got bloodied, their nose bloodied when they ventured into Vietnam in 1979, if you recall. And so they respect them. And so I said, one way to gain China's respect, you are not going to do it through negotiation. Somewhere there has to be some actual thing on ground. And we have always shied away from it. I remember the foreign secretary at the time when he came before the board, and I asked him, have you not thought about, reciprocating Chinese actions by nuclear missile arming countries on China's periphery? And he tells me, and I was very upset with that, and I jumped on him. He said, no, it's not practicable, Mr. Karnad. I said, practicable? I lost my cool, So as far as mature then, I'm not particularly mature now, but as far as mature then, I jumped on him. But the point to make is, how else do you, in some sense, gain China's respect or get their attention? That these guys mean business, that we need to have some kind of a solution for the disputed border. Let's do it. But something has to happen. And I've been saying that one way to trigger that is this. Nuclear missile arm, nuclear, and everybody starts jumping up and down because there are more peaceniks in Delhi than there are anywhere in the world, including the Arms Control Association of Washington, D.C. But the point is, I think, the point I think is that we need to do something, is what I always believed. To, in a sense, catch them by the scruff of the neck and say, look, okay, you want to play dirty, we'll play dirty with you, and we'll merely reciprocate what you have done. And I've called for the tit-for-tat policy. But again, the Indian government is a little too cautious, in my view, a little too hesitant in dealing with China on terms that the Chinese understand it as I see it. So this is where matters stand, but we are now we have sold the first tranche of BrahMos missiles to Philippines. We may be giving something, and we are giving other missiles to Vietnam, and other countries are in line, Indonesia, etc. So they'll get it. But we are 30 years too late. And there's opportunity cost to it. And the opportunity cost is in terms of not having a border solution. A boundary that both of us can mutually accept. And this is where matters stand, because there's always a cost to not doing things on time.
So speaking of weapon systems, I think we can now discuss this thing that you mentioned right at the beginning about the thermonuclear step for the Indian strategic forces. They haven't made it, right? So the arsenal in India is based on sort of 20 kiloton fission bombs, right? Not warheads, not fully thermonuclear warheads. Do you think that's an important step that India needs to actually take to be a credible deterrent? Or the alternative argument is, well, if you have a couple hundred missiles, Agni 5 missiles or whatever they are, and you can hit population centers in China with 20 kiloton bombs, it's still a pretty strong deterrent. So where do you come out on this?
But that's precisely the argument you hear in official circles, including in the Trombay circle. Again, they are not into strategy, and I tell them, please don't talk about strategy. Stick with what you know about science and engineering a weapon. But the point, I think, is that the Trombay contention is, and this is something that has been pushed by the former chairman, R. Chidambaram, who I think very badly of him. He's really been the bane of the country's nuclear program, as I see it. He's a chap who has been an absolute disaster. And he still rules the roost because he holds a Bhabha chair in Trombay. He's 90-year-old senile fellow. But, he's just mucking up things for everybody. Anyway, the point is, his thing is that whatever went wrong with the S1 device on May 13th, 1998, it can be corrected by computation, computational rejigging, through computers and separate component testing, etc. And I keep saying, how does it work? I mean, a thermonuclear, according to Richard Garvin, has some 2,000 parts. Or 2,000 things have to go right for a thermonuclear explosion to work. Whether the radiation channel, that's a problem in itself. We don't know what went wrong. So, and then you compounded your problem by triggering a number of devices at the same time, simultaneous triggering. So how do you then distinguish and discriminate the test results? It's a massive problem you created for yourself. And of course, credibility problems. For the Chinese, they are quite happy, because they know for certain that you cannot be certain, Indians cannot be certain that the thermonuclear they boast of will actually blow when it's required to. And the fact of the matter is that unless you test again, which is why I've been advocating from 1998 onwards, after the test, we need to test again, which, by the way, was the advice given by the director of field testing at the Pokhran test site. Because he saw that it didn't work, and he advised the government, we have to test again. But the government so far, and then we signed the nuclear deal that is conditioned on India not renewing tests. We in a sense, hinder ourselves this way. But I suppose if we make up our mind to test, we'll test it. Go ahead and test it. The thermonuclear, and this time I've said, if you're going to test, let it be open-ended and no nonsense about it. Go megaton thermonuclear, because you have to get, you cannot talk about tailored yield and all that nonsense. Tailored yield is after you have really had great experience with single yield devices which have attained their planned yield, etc. Don't start. We start jumping at the edge kind of technologies without going through the process. Wow, every other country has had huge data from large number of tests, and India has had just 6 tests altogether. 7 tests, 6 tests, 5 tests and 1. Yeah, 74 tests. So 6 tests.
So going back to your expertise in the theory of deterrence. So, for a long time, China tried to claimed it was maintaining just a minimal deterrent against the United States, and it could have been as few as maybe 20 megaton sized deliverable warheads. But now, of course, they've shifted completely to this notion that, I think maybe just to manage the psychological attitude of the Americans, they have to have a much bigger force, even though probably destroying 20 major cities, or I guess they have MIRV weapons. So destroying 50 major U.S. cities would be enough of a deterrent, and they don't need to do this. But I think it's based on a psychological judgment of the American attitudes. It says we just have to have more. Now we're building fields of hundreds of silos just to increase our deterrent capability. Is that your attitude for India, that in actual terms, these 20 kiloton warheads are really actually sufficient to destroy the economy of China and kill, hundreds of millions of people? But for just purely psychological reasons, you have to have a bigger stick. Is that the right analysis? Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. In fact, I've used it precisely. The reason one of my basic tenets of my advocacy is precisely this: that unless you can match China's 3.3 megaton standard issue weapon warhead on their Dongfang 3, 4s, and 5s, etc., and the 21s. 21 might be 500 kiloton, but the Dongfang 3, 4, 5s are 3.3 megaton warheads. Now, I said, unless you reach at least a megaton level, you won't have the psychological parity. And it makes all the difference, because deterrence is, I've argued, as is the fact, it's a mind game. But if you're going to play mind games, if you have 3.3 incoming over Delhi, do you think any Indian politician who are very nervous Nellies, really, from my experience with them, would any of them risk anything? If you have nothing of the kind, you have a 20 kiloton, I called it a firecracker, a 20 kiloton firecracker against a 3.3 megaton incoming. So, it's a real psychological problem. And it's a deterrence problem at the heart of it. Because ultimately, if the Chinese want to owe you and want to, they need do nothing more than just take out their Dongfang 3s or 4s, roll them out of their mountain, tunnels,
Silos.
and let our satellites pick it up in a crisis. And what is India going to do? I mean, say, oh yeah, we're going to, send our Agni 5 with a 20 kiloton surefire firecracker into Shanghai. I mean, okay, it might work in normal times, but if you have you're dealing. I've always said you have to deal with the Indian leadership, the psychological makeup of the Indian leadership, which is very, very timid. Timidity is the hallmark. I've always argued, and this really makes it problematic. And it's a real problem. It's not an abstract problem. This problem of deterrence from the Indian side is real because we are easily spooked in any crisis, nuclear, non-nuclear, military, any crisis. And what happened in the Bombay seaborne attack? I mean, everybody's running around like headless chickens in Mumbai. Everybody. And the so-called special forces, this, that. I mean, a whole bunch of people just did not know a thing of what they do, honestly. And you are expecting that, and that's why I oppose the no first use principle. I've been opposing it ever since. I said we can't take the first monsoon strike, for God's sake. I mean, our cities are flooded. And you think we can take the first nuclear strike? Really? I mean, how foolish or silly is it? And yeah, but people understand what I'm saying. But they say, well, okay, some government has to make up its mind. Some prime minister has to say, okay, fine, we'll go first use. It's what I recommended in my last book, 2018 book. It's called Staggering Forward, Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition, which I've argued that one way, okay, if you're not going to get a solution, a negotiated settlement with China, then let's at least then play it hard and forward deploy our nuclear weapons as a tripwire. Use atomic demolition munitions, which is what I said in my the Nuclear Weapons and Indian Security book earlier. Use the ADM, the atomic demolition munitions, as a tripwire. It's a passive defensive measure. You're not actively going out there threatening the Chinese PLA encampments or anything alike of that kind. You're merely placing these things. You don't have to, naturally, you won't disclose where they are put, but you know the valleys through which the PLA might ingress, and then you place them there and tell the Chinese, look, if you come in through break through the LAC, fine, you risk a tripwire. You're already in place there. It's your call. You want to be offensive about it? Go ahead. Because we are not being offensive. We are being defensive. We are merely placed the ADMs, and then we are going to place our Agni 7s, Agni 1s with a 700-kilometer, and that can cover most of the missile emplacements in the Tibetan plateau, etc., whatever targets you want to hit, etc. And leave it to the Chinese to take the risk, but at least generate some risk for the Chinese. But right now, it's risk-free. It's cost-free to the Chinese, even in the abstract sense of things escalating. Because you have nothing. I said, because you cannot match the infrastructure build-up, because you do not have conventional parity, because you don't have so many other things, communication, so on and so forth, then up the ante and get down to forward deploying the nuclear weapons. You might think that, very provocative. It's not. It's a normal, reasonable deterrence posture to assume when you are placed in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite reasonable that if you're facing conventional overmatch, that you might reserve use of nuclear weapons to defend yourself in an existential scenario where the conventional overmatch is leading to existential risk for your polity. I would think the other side would just assume that that's a risk, even if you have a quote no first use policy. Right? So, who's going to abide by that if you're getting overrun? Like maybe you'll actually use your nukes, right?
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely, yeah.
So let me since we're talking about nuclear weapons, maybe we can go back to Bhabha a little bit. So Homi Bhabha died in 1966. Is that right?
Yes, February
And
66.
he was an incredible figure. I actually want to say this to all the physicists out there. You just know this formula for Bhabha scattering, but Go look into this guy. This guy had tremendous patriotism. He was a visionary. He wanted India to master the 3 different fuel cycles and even build thorium reactors. I mean, the guy was incredible, and he was very instrumental in building up fundamental science in India, establishing institutes and such. Um, he died mysteriously. His flight over Mont Blanc blew up and I guess crashed. And I don't know what the final story is, but I know at least some people, perhaps my guest today, believe that this was not an accident, that actually he may have been killed by the CIA, who were uncomfortable with the India nuclear weapons program at the time.
Well, absolutely. I think the CIA, look, India benefited a lot in getting the knowledge really with the Atoms for Peace literature that was declassified by the US government, as you recall. And so we had stores of it brought home from wherever, Vienna and so on, and people gained from it. Bhabha, from the very first day, he was the director at TIFR, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, which was the seedbed for the Indian Atomic Energy Program, as you may be aware. And the first batch of incoming scientists in the TIFR batch was P.K. Iyengar. And P.K. Iyengar, Dr. Iyengar told me that, look, we were told from day one when Bhabha came in and said, look, we are going to proceed parallelly on what in effect was the bomb track and the civilian nuclear reactor track. Civilian users and military users would proceed parallelly, and that there would be no distinction. And in real sense, I think Nehru also pretty much signaled it. In Parliament, he talked about our nuclear program being Janus-faced. I mean, how more revealing can you be?
Yeah, it's rather obvious,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah.
Right. The Greek god with 2 faces looking in opposite directions. He called it Janus-faced. And he was very clear about it, what he intended the Indian government to do vis-a-vis the atom, the civilian atom and the military atom. The remarkable thing about Nehru, and here I think Nehru is, I started out as a bit of a skeptic, think of Nehru as woolly-headed and so on. He was in various respects vis-a-vis China, and he completely misjudged everything. He rejected the United Nations Security Council seat that Chiang Kai-shek's, Taiwan vacated, Formosa vacated. That was offered to us by both Russia and John Foster Dulles, Ike's administration to India. And we said, no, China deserves it better. I mean, it's the level of self-abnegation that is hurtful.
Yeah, they still haven't recovered from that. They deserve a seat, but they still have one.
Yes. Yeah. China is now in a position to block India's entry forever. Anyway, so we have been a little too Boy Scoutish about it. And Bhabha was very clear. His 1955 3-stage plan that you were referring to, the first brace of natural uranium fuel reactors producing the feedstock for the breeder reactor, which in turn provides the feedstock for the thorium reactor. And that was based entirely on the last stage raw material, thorium, and India has the largest reserves of thorium in the world. That's the basis, and it's out there. You don't need much by way of, mining it and so on. You may have to refine it. We simply, the sands, the monazite sands on the Kerala coast. This Coromandel coast, you just lift it up. There's thorium. Nature has blessed us. So, and that was the basic point that Bhabha started out with. And he worked backwards to say, well, okay, what do we do? The marvelous thing is between Bhabha and Nehru, and you might think there's a little covert and they had their own little thing going. But how do you, as you perhaps are aware, Bhabha was the first chair of the Atoms for Peace Conference in Geneva in 1955. But even as he was the chair in Atoms for Peace and all that, and he was talking up this, thing about how the future of the world is going to be hugely benefited by peaceful atom and so on. He was talking to Nehru about getting the NRX reactor from Canada, which became the CANDO reactor, which fueled the nuclear weapons program. And he told Nehru that. This was a cipher correspondence in secret going on between Bhabha in Geneva, who was signing the, who was booking the deal for the Canadian NRX with this in mind, weapons in mind. It was an extraordinary thing. And the great thing is Nehru put up this beautiful strategy of misleading the West into thinking, oh, we are for peace, and Indians, oh, well, they are all for peace and disarmament. And India's disarmament campaign in the world was a beautifully done operation, because it, in a sense, covered up for what we were actually doing in terms of trying to get to a stage where we could make bombs and weapons. And we reached a threshold with the plutonium reprocessing plant going on stream in March of 1964. Nehru dies in 1964. The Chinese test on October 16, 1964. Everything is happening in 64. In 62, when the Chinese humiliated Indian army in the Himalayas, Bhabha went to Nehru and said, let me explode conduct a test. It'll raise our spirits of a beaten people and so on. And Nehru always, one of the things about great people are, they always have frailties. In Nehru's case is that he was called the Hamlet of Indian politics. Very indecisive at the wrong times. And his constant thing to Bhabha was, be ready, but not now, not now, not now. And he died saying not now. And the trouble with the Indian nuclear weapons program was it was so secret and it was so shielded structurally, bureaucratically, and so on. By the way, it's the only department of government that writes its own checks, by the way. Only department of the government. There's no financial advisors. Finance ministry doesn't have a say. The Secretary of the Department of Atomic Energy writes his check. This year we want X number of, rupees. And there's no finagling with the finance ministry. The finance ministry just has to say, okay, that's fine. And that's the reason why this thing was set up. It's a two-man loop. The Secretary of the Department of Atomic Energy and Director of BARC, which were co-terminal. Bhabha was everything and everything. She was Secretary Government, Department of Atomic Energy, Director of the Trombay establishment, etc. And the Chief Advisor to the Prime Minister on nuclear matters, atomic matters. And he prevailed on Nehru to be also the Minister of Atomic Energy. So you see the two-man loop. There's no bureaucrats involved. No, and by the way, it's the only paperless ministry in the world. There is no paper. Nothing is put down on paper, even now. The prime ministerial decision is given, by word of mouth. Yeah, he tells you, okay, you do it. There's nothing on paper. But even then, Bhabha and Nehru were aware that various Western agencies would be interested, various people would be interested. So no paper trail. And because Indian system otherwise is very well known for everything and for duplicate, we generate paper by cutting down forests like mad. Every little thing is. So, he said no. So financial sovereignty, autonomy for the department, absolute secrecy, no bureaucrat knew about it. The downside was there were no stakeholders in the bureaucracy after it died. They both died. So Bhabha was central and he was taken away by these nefarious needs. And then Nehru died, and the two people who were in charge of the entire program were gone. And Lal Bahadur Shastri, who stepped in, didn't know a thing about anything, nor did any of the civil service bureaucracy. It's incredible how they kept the secrets, even from the CIA. Because one of the things that the CIA later said, we can track the damn things, and they have the capability. And Nehru was upfront. He asked Major General Nichols, if you recall. Major General Nichols was the manager of the Trinity explosion in New Mexico. And he passed through Delhi. He was trying to peddle some reactors of his own. So Nehru asked him, called him into his office and asked Bhabha in as well. I recall, I sort of detailed that meeting in the book. And he said, do you think Bhabha can do it? Meaning build a bomb. And Nichols said, yes, from what I've seen in Trombay, yes. Yes. And he said, this was 62, 63, mind. So, we have missed the boat. And and it has hurt us hugely.
So can I ask you about that history? So Nehru dies in 64. Baba is still in place. And
Still in place, but
is
again had no traction because nobody then in government knew anything about it. First, they had to verify what Bhabha was saying. Well, there was, again, no paper.
right.
It was just
So
Baba saying that Nehru had authorized me. And here, nothing is so, shall we say, suspect as anything with no paper trail, in the Indian system. Because there was no
so
paper trail, very difficult.
if Nehru is gone and Baba is having some trouble now because this special relationship is not in place anymore, why would the CIA kill him in 66? Why then? Why not earlier?
Because
Any
Bhabha was still proceeding with the idea that we should have something ready. So the reprocessing unit was, shall we say, revving up.
Yep.
And that is a very iffy thing, the reprocessing. And then we got it. We got a little amount, and the amount needed for an actual explosion, we didn't reach it until about 1970.
I see.
To
So
have,
there were still critical things in
see, but
ongoing.
that had to be done under the government's, uh, without the government coming to know of it. This is Bhabha's own agenda, because he thought he had the thing going with Nehru, and that was his brief. And so the Central Intelligence Agency, I think, knew of it. And then this guy, Crowley, was Robert Crowley, who became the head of clandestine ops in the CIA, and he had some very racially abusive things to say about Bhabha and so on. If you look at the conversations, it's not very nice. So, so he, and so Bhabha was targeted because everybody knew that he was the man. He was the linchpin. You take out the linchpin and the whole thing collapses, which happened, really.
So just for my audience, this guy, Robert Crowley, who was a high-level CIA operative, I guess on his deathbed or when he was dying, gave a set of interviews. And in those, I think it's something like Interview with the Crow. His nickname was the Crow.
That's right. Conversations with the Crow.
Conversations with the Crow. And you can find this book. And Crowley basically says that they killed Baba and by putting a bomb on his plane in the luggage compartment. People are, I think, divided on whether Crowley is a reliable source. What I'm curious about is, if the leader of the Chinese bomb program or the Iranian bomb program were assassinated or killed, died mysteriously, the internal security services of that country would eventually come to an opinion about, well, what happened here? Was this actually just an accident, or is there some foreign power that's knocking off our top scientists? I'm just curious if among people who would know in that generation, do you know what their opinions are about what happened?
No, as I sort of mentioned to you in my message, yes, I think the Trombay people knew right away. Right away meaning they suspected, and then the way it happened after they got the technical details about the flight path and so on and so forth, they're very certain what happened.
I see.
They were the plane was on the glide path to Geneva airport and so on, and Mount Blanc it sort of veered off, and you can see if the cargo hold blows up, how the thing, and they sort of in those times may have simulated it. I don't know, but they were very certain because everybody that I talked to, the old stalwarts, were not there anymore.
Your father's friends.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Your father's friends, maybe.
Yes, my father's friends. And who were the first batch of Bhabha students scientists coming into the nuclear establishment in 1947. And by the way, our Indian Atomic Energy Agency, Indian Atomic Energy Commission, predated the American Atomic Energy Commission by several years. That October, when the Chinese set off the explosion, Trombay arranged for a plane the Air India flight actually, that used to go to Hong Kong, to fly as near the Chinese border as they could to see if something could be picked up. And they swapped the aircraft after it came back. And they knew that the Chinese had an implosion trigger. So they detected all that before it ever came out. So within a week of the Chinese explosion, October 16th, 64, the Trombay establishment had come to know that this was what they'd used. They'd used an implosion trigger, that this was the yield, etc., etc. They got the basics down. And that was my reason for saying that Bhabha proceeded with, even after Nehru's death, by continuing to do what he was doing on the weapons front, was because of this. They had the Chinese thing. He had, arranged for all the data to come in and have it analyzed by his scientists. And they came to a conclusion, yes, the Chinese have this, and then we should have it too. And we'll proceed on the basis that we're going to have it. So, so that was the basis on which they proceeded.
I was going to say that I thought if somebody blew Baba up, the Chinese probably had more motivation than the CIA, right?
No, actually, no. Because if you recall, the CIA tried blowing up Zhou Enlai. You don't know that?
Is that right? No, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. At the Bandung conference, the Indian, Nehru in his Chini Hindi Bhai Bhai days, India-China brothers.
Yes.
He sent an Air India plane called the Kashmir Princess to pick up Zhou Enlai. And that was blown up over sea or someplace like that. Incredible.
I guess I had heard the story. Yes, Zhou Enlai took a different plane, right?
Took a different plane. So he got to know of it and let the plane go. And that plane blew up. Again, it's the same kind of mine in the cargo hold, the timed explosion. So,
incredible.
This is something that they tried. They've done it. The CIA has done it. I mean, and the Kashmir Princess blew up. So, in Air India, and we have been very, very tolerant, shall I say, of the American actions. And they've done it all alone.
I have written a couple papers with Iranian physicists, and there have been assassinations over the last 10, 20 years going on there. And sometimes, strangely, like a guy who's very theoretical, like a string theorist, gets blown up. And I asked my colleagues, I said, was this guy secretly doing some defense work in his spare time? They said, no, this guy was very pure. He was doing just mathematical physics. And I think they're just blowing these guys up to scare us. Like sometimes they're not even blowing up the right people, but just to scare everybody. So
this might be more the Israeli Mossad at work.
Oh, this is I'm sure it's Israel, not I'm not sure about anything, but it's probably Israel. Yeah.
No, they're basically Mossad. I think Netanyahu was virtually admitted that. And I think I've been to Israel many times, and I liaise with them. I think they said, look, we can't take chances. The attitude is they simply can't risk anything.
Yes, of course.
Zero risk. We are going to make it zero risk. We don't care. Assuming what you say is right, killing the wrong people. Say we can't take any risks. And I've heard that from people, from Israeli, pretty high up. We can't take any risks. And I used to joke with them, but here in India, that takes all the risks unbidden. At the other end of the spectrum. Tolerant.
But India is not going anywhere. I think India is no one is an existential threat to India. I think India will, if India can just develop its own internal economy, it will thrive. I think that's basically
Absolutely. But then, so many things, our democracy also works against us, as you know, because it's one thing, you guys are having problems in a so-called developed democracy of yours, after the Trump thing and so on. And you have a real problem in America. So think of India, where, it's such a patchwork country of different ethnicities, racial types. I mean, we are the ultimate mongrel nation.
Yeah.
It's very unlike the Chinese, and we are the ultimate melting point. Daniel Moynihan's notion of America, I laugh at it. When Americans talk about America as a melting pot. My God, India is the ultimate melting pot, and Brazil perhaps comes next, but China is absolutely homogeneous. Yeah. So they have a great many, shall we say, advantages when dealing with India.
They have a long history of an organized central
consensus, decisions in India on anything.
Yes.
On any issue, there'll be literally 10 different positions. And Modi, in that sense, has perhaps has streamlined the decision-making process and been a bit more aggressively nationalist. But, If he loses in next year's election, he's out. So we'll go back to Congress Party and all their iffy kind of politicking and so on. So we don't know what will happen. So we have
So
the
I,
same kind of uncertainties that the United States has from
yeah,
administration to administration.
yeah.
The Chinese have
One,
none of.
one thing that people have kind of forgotten in the West, but people from East Asia remember this, that every one of the tigers that developed to modernity had an authoritarian period. Like
That's right.
South Korea, Taiwan, they had Singapore, they had authoritarian government to get things on the right track. And then only later, very recently, did they implement democracy. So I think that's in the minds of the Chinese communists as well. So
Absolutely. But that also is, as you know, Steve, most of Southeast Asia, it's called Indochina, of course, but the cynic elements in this are more pronounced in terms of the Confucian order, the notion of the
yes,
Confucian order, hierarchy, and so on.
yes,
There's more, when democracy doesn't sit that easily, because it's not natural to the culture. There's a
yep,
Confucian order, it's a very different, very disciplined kind of setup. While
yep,
in India, we are a hybrid of everything. We do not have the Western innovation. We do not have the Confucian discipline. We are just, we are everywhere, doing everything and going nowhere fast. I mean, it's that kind of a conundrum, that kind of a bubble we are in. I mean, we don't know how to get out of it, but that will take time. I mean, I'm optimistic, but the Chinese are, in that sense, far more on the ball. They know their game, and they play it well. They play it hard. It's something that the Indian government has to learn to do. Play game hard, and play it for high stakes, because the Chinese, in that sense, are very singularly
mhm,
oriented,
yes,
and they know what they're doing and what they want. Here, we don't even know what we want. There is no strategy paper. There's no vision paper. Xi Jinping says we want to be, by 2049, we want to be the predominant power. He has said so. Whether China becomes one is a different thing. But he has a vision that he has set before all the parties within his country, all the constituencies, PLA, industry,
yep,
private sector, everybody is on board. They know, okay, we have to reach this. Here we have nothing. And I keep saying, where is the vision paper? Where is Modi saying, okay, we by 20, and we have very abstract notions. Vishwa Guru, which is what I have really criticized in my last book, Staggering Forward. What does Vishwa Guru mean? Vishwa Guru means universal sage. I mean, okay, that's nice, but how does it work? I mean, is it by acclamation? I mean, how are you made the Vishwa Guru? So this is our problem. Even the most hard-minded amongst us, our politicians, still come up with these abstract notions as vision. Not at all strategic. They're completely abstract. So, in that sense, because the Chinese have very practical-minded people, which is what I always appreciate. Chinese have, India invented zero, algebra. But the Chinese built canals. They built, the great, mastered the riverine system, Great Wall of China. They have actually done things over thousands of years. And we have just gone into, okay, brilliant. We are brilliant. Zero was invented here, fine. Algebra was invented here, fine. But what did you do with it in practical terms? Really? Which is where I think our Indian culture is lacking. We are not
can I,
materially oriented.
so I've kept you a long time, and could I close with, there are two questions about Indian culture that I kind of wanted to ask you about. So
Sure,
could we just close with that? Would that be okay?
sure.
Okay. So one is, yeah, I've heard you mention this term "land of subjugation" before, which I guess originated from this Polish sociologist who spent time in India. Could you flesh that out a little bit? So, in what sense do you mean that? Do you mean that because there are castes and the people in those have maintained those roles for thousands of years, that is that the form of subjugation, or what is meant by that?
No, I think he meant foreign subjugations.
Yes.
That almost all and any waves of invaders that have come in from the passes, the Himalayan passes or the Hindu Kush passes from Afghanistan and so on, periodic raids, they then set up shop as emperors and rulers of India. As easy as that. The campaign season would start, and the Afghan looters would come in through the Bolan Pass and the Khyber Pass, come into Delhi to loot Delhi. Because the Indo-Gangetic plain was rich, it was fertile. There's enormous wealth produced at the time. Addison, the Addison's data about India and China in 1787 or whatever it was. China had 25% of the world trade. India had 24% of the world trade. In whenever, 17, late 18th, 18th century, yeah, or 17th century, whatever it was. So, Addison Mattingly's data, his book.
Angus Madison, I think you mean.
Yeah, it isn't Matt. Yeah, it's Angus Madison.
Is this phrase "land of subjugation"? Is it equivalent to the observations by colonial British that the Indians are not a martial people? Like, I think they said things like that when they first came, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it's not martial. You see, the caste system is very deleterious in that respect, because what it talks about are these 4 castes, and soldiering is to be done by one caste. So protection of the sovereign state or kingdom, whatever, was the duty or responsibility of one caste, the second caste, the warrior caste, the Kshatriya caste. Well, you can have only so many people in that caste. So all the rest of the society was spared any responsibility of protecting it. If invaders came, hey, that warrior caste is supposed to do it. If they fail, that's our karma or fate. Very fatalistic. It bred a very fatalistic fatalism in Indian society. It's a very fatalistic society.
Yes.
In that sense, our culture. So it bred that. And then this was added to by Hinduism and Buddhism, where you say, well, life is a maya, which is illusion. Life is illusion. All of this sort of meshes into making Indians and India a very passive culture. It's not that you can't fight, but the culture says, well, you're not supposed to. Some caste is going to do the fighting for you, or if you're being beaten, it's okay. That's your fate. Accept it. That's what Mahatma Gandhi's. I completely think is a complete idiot and a fraud, and I've said so in all my books. He's the worst kind of fraud who he did great violence to India, because he could have, quite literally, he could have driven the British out by the 1920s. And he did. He acted like a recruiting sergeant for the British Army in the First World War, Boer War, and then the First World War. And then in the Second World War, he just said, well, yeah, it was wishy-washy. He was a complete goof-off, the more you think of him. So I'm no fan of Gandhi's. But
spoken like a real hard power realist.
I'm an absolute hard power realist. So, I think all the non-violence is crap. I'm sorry. It doesn't work in real life. The thing is, you have to protect what you have. You can't live on the mercies of other countries. Or as, was the Tennessee Williams character in Streetcar Named Desire, Dubois, Blanche Dubois, who says, I live on the kindnesses of strangers.
Yes.
That's what I've said. We have lived on kindnesses of strangers. We can do it, let's do it. And let's not rely on inheritance, and so on and so forth.
The Chinese are obsessed with hard power because they saw their summer palace burned and all of their objects are taken to London, and other places. So they learned the hard way about hard power, right? So
absolutely. No, but also, to be fair to the Chinese history has been very, very bloody. The Taiping Rebellion, the kind of massacres, and it's hideous to think of it.
Yeah, they don't fool around.
They don't fool around. My God, to me, when I read of it, I'm absolutely, I'm awed by how they've overcome that and become a great nation. So, and I admire the Chinese and I admire China because of how single-mindedly it proceeds to get what it wants. And it's very practical.
Let me finish with my last question. So, from the Chinese perspective, they envy Indians because Indian elites speak beautiful English, actually, and therefore you can operate much better in the Western world. Many elite intellectuals from China, including my father, who was an engineering professor, never really spoke very good English. Like he would not be able to convince other people of his point of view because of his limited linguistic capabilities. And it's quite hard because the two languages are so far apart. Um, so one thing that surprised me, which I didn't realize until fairly late, that it seems to me that all the intellectual discourse in India is actually happening in English. Is that true? Like, do you feel
No,
like,
absolutely.
in a way, the British have still colonized, in a sense, all the kind of high culture in India, and it persists to this day? Will that persist forever, or what do you think will happen? Could you maybe just react to
Yes,
that observation? Yeah.
yes, I think it's a great observation. The fact is, I think Modi is trying to um change that. That's why there's a little controversy of Modi saying, having that legend on his table in the plenary of the G20 meet that says Bharat, which my name, by the way, for India. It's
Yeah.
a Sanskrit name for the country, Bharat. And in the constitution, it says India, that is Bharat. We the people of India, that is Bharat. So in the constitution, both the names are there. The indigenous Bharat, when it becomes personal, it becomes Bharat. When for the country, it's Bharat. So that's how it is. That's how you distinguish the personal from the collective. Uh, but that's it. It's hard to get it. Look, English language has been a great boon for all the reasons that you just mentioned. We can slip into any mainstream anywhere, any Western mainstream anywhere, and begin to, you know, I recall what Krishna Menon, our first defense minister, not first, Nehru's confidant, and he's the one who sort of championed Indian independence, India League in London and so on in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s. And, one, I think it was BBC or somebody, um, deigned to ask him, but Mr. Menon, you speak such good English. I know, I think it was after, it was an American, obviously. No, some such thing. I think it
Of
was an
course.
American at the
Yes.
United Nations, where, he spoke for the longest time in UN history. He spoke for 13 hours or something. It's like literally ridiculous record. You can check it up. I'm not sure of the figure, so don't hold me to it. But he spoke so beautifully in English and bring in poetry and big literature, this, that, English liberal thought, Thomas Locke, and everything else which had no connection. I mean, the entire United Nations was sitting there getting a lesson in world history from Krishna Menon. Anyway, so an American, I think, approached him and said, Mr. Menon, you speak such beautiful English. And then, Mr. Menon is reported to have pulled himself to full height, and he was a tall man. He said, yes, because you learn English, we study it. Learn by the way of mother tongue, I mean,
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
the
No,
West.
I get it. I think he's 100% right. But it was, for an outsider, it's amazing that, if I go on YouTube and I want to hear what are intellectuals discussing in Delhi, I can go listen to a panel discussion with you on it, and you're all discussing in English. It's kind
Yeah.
of amazing, actually. Yeah.
Because in many respects, we are not all that fluent in the Hindi language. And Hindi is just one language, by the way. In peninsular India, there are, how many languages and dialects? Some 300 main. There's supposed to be 1,000 dialects. But 300 main languages, 28 recognized languages, something like that. I mean, it's just extraordinary melange, really. The lingual melange is so incredible, and it's cross fertilization. I mean, you have English words coming in, Urdu words coming in, Persian word. It's a mix of everything, and so a South Indian may not understand a North Indian. A person from Assam may not understand a Gujarati, which is the Prime Minister's home state. No, this is India. So the common language, however bad it is by way of colonial legacy, and it's true, it can be hindering. It's not your native tongue. But the fact is, it has given us a little edge in terms of international transnational industry, commerce, academics. There are a lot of Indians now in the academia in America, in UK, and elsewhere, in the top positions. And the Chinese are, in that sense, perhaps not anymore. I think they've come up, are slightly disadvantaged because of the language thing, but otherwise they're excellent and perhaps better. But the thing is that English is also, it's a boon in that respect, but a bane in that because it's a borrowed language, it's a colonial language, and that's the lingua franca, by the way, officially. There's in Hindi, but English is a co-language, which the South Indians want to retain. They say, no, we don't want Hindi to be imposed on us, and we'll keep it English. Because otherwise we'll demand Tamil to be the state language, and so on and so forth. This separatist notions, Nobody wants to deal with the language aspects. But it is a problem because I think the Chinese, from the very beginning, understood and admired their own culture and were schooled in it and are rooted in it, while we are not in our own indigenous culture. Their culture, of course, is the Indian culture, the Hindu culture, envelopes all of the subcontinent, including Pakistan. Islam in Pakistan is nothing like the desert Islam of Saudi Arabia. I mean, all the rituals are Hindu rituals. All the marriage rituals are Hindu rituals. I thought, so what's different? I've attended marriages, and I'm from the Goa side. I'd say Western Indian, West Indian from the Goa side. And my wife is a Punjabi from the north. And her mother was from where is present-day Pakistan, from Dera Ghazi Khan. And my mother-in-law was in Dera Ghazi Khan. My father-in-law was from East Punjab, meaning Indian side of Punjab. And it's such a mix. And you go to Pakistan and you attend the weddings, it's very like a Punjabi wedding, which was mine. Like my wife was Punjabi, so we had a Punjabi wedding. No different, except you have the Quran in the thing, and you say, well, in the Hindu thing, you go around the fire 7 times. There's only difference. Otherwise, everything else, the 3-day wedding ceremony, exactly the same. Paste, yes. Turmeric paste put on bridegrooms and brides, etc. Everything is the same. So, that's Hindu culture. It's extraordinarily penetrative. So Islam has touched it very barely. Sure, Pakistan is swear by Islam and so on and so forth. But the point is, everything else is it's subcontinental. It's, I won't say Hindu, but it's Indian culture. That's a better umbrella to describe the subcontinental culture, South Asian culture.
Great. Bharat, I thank you for your time, and hopefully we can continue this conversation on another day.
Thank you very much.